Hi, my name's Rafe Nowen, and this is Another Self. You may have been following the Netflix series Another Self with Ada Sevgi and Leila and Zaman, and you will have seen on there the way that the constellation model started by Bert Hellinger operates within the field of energy in family systems. And what it shows us very, very adequately is that we all carry with us some historical aspects. It's worth taking a look at Bruce Lipton and the term epigenetics. The thing about genetics is that until relatively recently, probably 15 years, 20 years now, it was believed that everything was carried within the DNA and therefore was passed on as is to the next generation. But in fact, it's been proved very, very adequately that that's not true. The main function is the epigenetic element. The genetic element is I share 60% of my DNA with a banana, and it's just that the cells create new cells. And they need a blueprint. They need to know what a cell for me looks like. But all the cells in my body are identical in their origin. When they start out, a nerve cell, a blood cell, a hair cell, a bone cell, everything, skin cell, everything. They all start out identically. But then they get adapted by the signals and the proteins that they receive. And the proteins determine what they're going to look like and how they're going to function. And therefore, if you think about it, it's absolutely logical. All cells begin with one cell, the egg. It gets fertilized, it's still one cell, and it goes then divides into 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, all the rest, 64, sorry. And so on and so on and so on. And at 11 days, the cells can migrate from being a umbilical cord, an embryo, or a placenta. If there's a damage in the placenta or damage in the embryo, then cells can be distributed back into that to repair it. But the point of the Another Self is that because of that epigenetic element, in other words, the signals coming from the outside, it means that, for example, my father was born in the First World War in Paris, so he was a prisoner in Paris effectively because he was supposed to be born in England. His mother and father wanted him to be born in England, not in war-torn Paris, but he couldn't make it back because of the war. And then in the Second World War, he was stationed in Burma and saw some serious action there, and then he was wounded in Dunkirk. So he saw many people murdered and killed in various different places. And then the precursor cells that created his sperm were made in between, beginning of 1950 and beginning of 1949 and when I was conceived in beginning of 1950. I was born in the end of 1950, and I inherit some of those traumas, inevitably. So some of those experiences are locked in. And what the Another Self series shows very eloquently is that the connection between these old things that we believe we shouldn't know, we shouldn't be told or shouldn't know about, like the death of a child early in a family where a stillborn or a miscarriage or an abortion shouldn't be talked about. It should be forgotten about. Let it go. Don't worry about it. But actually, we carry the energy of those elements with us, and we kind of know about them. I often say in my workshops that there's two memories. There's one up here, which is the cognitive memory. It's the memory that we get from learning things, being told things and reading things and all that sort of stuff. But then there's another memory which goes back to time immemorial, and we do remember things. Certain people will recognise that they, land in Florida, for example, and they feel like they've come home, and they don't understand why, because they've never been there before, and it just doesn't seem to make any sense. It doesn't make sense up here. It makes complete sense down here. And what the series is about is showing the model of constellations, which enables you to display the elements that you're dealing with in your life out loud. So you can see that your mother's in distress, or you can see that your father. They don't need to be told that you're doing the work. They may have died many years before, but you can still see where the people that are used to represent the people in they're not, they're not gifted psychics. They're just picking up energy, and it's the same as when somebody walks into a shopping centre and they don't feel very comfortable doing that. They want to go to somewhere else. Let's go to a small shop. Lots of people feel that sometimes. Not every time, but sometimes. Or they may walk past a person and they say, "Oh, I get a good bad feeling of him or her," and they move aside. Well, that's fine. But in the constellation model, we're using that energy to understand what it is that we're carrying. And quite often in our life, we feel ongoing anxiety, we're constant overthinking, or we're repeating relationship struggles. We may realise that we've married the same man 4 times, or whatever it is. Those repeats are often to do with the history that we've had, and it may be not our personal history, but our historic history, and epigenetically. And remember that epigenetics covers also the if you're parented by, say for example, your birth parents die the day you're born. It happens. It's tragic, it's awful, people feel survivor guilt in that context, of course they do. But then they get fostered maybe 3 times, and then they get adopted, and life goes on, and they get to adulthood and they realise they've got some churning to do. Well, if you look at those pictures, you realise that they didn't have 2 parents. They might have had 6 or 7, an odd number of parents. They might have had 3. It just depends on life circumstances, how they got to be who they are. And it's as though you're another self, and you see yourself as another self. And the big thing about a constellation model piece of work is that what you see is yourself without all the stuff that drives you every day. You don't see your mother, your father, the bits and pieces, jealousy, anger, trauma. Those things are separately established as other people in the room, or other things in the room. I work with bits of felt, as you'll see on Zaman. You can work with little figures, little pieces of resin. And what you see is that you can separate those out and see the juxtaposition of different things. If you're standing in the middle and your mother's facing this way and your dad's facing this way, you've never been seen. And as soon as you say that to somebody in the constellation context, what happens is they go, "Oh my God, of course. That's why I feel invisible. I've gone through life feeling invisible." And it's because I'm sorry to say, but the archetype parent, the perfect mother and the perfect father, just don't exist. We're all imperfect in one way or another, and we're just good enough. And believe it or not, every parent does their very best. Their best may not be very good. Their best may be awful for you. But if you've arrived at adulthood, then they did enough for you to become an adult, which means that they didn't kill you and they didn't stop you surviving. So whatever happens, you got to the finish line of being a child. And if you got to the finish line of being a child, then seeing all the things that impact on your life as you go by matter. And when you set it up, I mean, I urge you to watch the series if you haven't seen it already, Another Self on Netflix, and because it demonstrates how you have to suspend disbelief a little bit, but nevertheless, and of course it's a drama on TV. But the point is that it's not a drama on TV when I run a workshop and I see the things that he sees like that. You see those things. You see somebody walking down the street and you realise they've got a war wound and you think, I wonder how that happened. But you don't know that they... And if you go up to them and say, why have you got a war wound? They say, I was knocked down by a cab the other day. But actually the connection between those two, when you dig in and you realise that there's a connection, you realise that his grandfather died in the war, was shot in the leg, and it went septic and he died, and nobody talked about it, or whatever it is. And then it becomes a thing that is hidden and secret, and those secrets become the thing that you actually feel. You don't know enough to dismiss it. You just know something. I had a guy who was a policeman at Hillsborough. He had a terrible time there. He had a terrible time since. He was one of the few police officers who refused to sign his witness statement. His witness statement came back with it signed. He didn't sign it. His sign was he was a bit OCD and he always signed it in a straight line, but his signature came back like most on an angle. They had forged his signature onto a witness statement which was typed, and he hadn't typed a letter. Those stories are, there's plenty of them, and they're real. But what showed up in the piece of work that we did was that he'd always thought he ought to have been a girl. It wasn't that he was camp or gay or anything. He was a big burly policeman. He had kids. He'd married and so on. And what showed up was this thing which skeptically he resisted and dismissed. But a week later, he phoned up to say, "You'll never believe this," and yeah, I probably will, because I hear those stories lots. And what he said was that his mother and he had gone out for a meal on a few days after the piece of work that he'd done. And he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And what turned out was that she'd had a miscarriage 53 years before that day. And she remembered the day, she remembered what they'd had for supper, she remembered the pain, she remembered the fact that her husband hadn't come back from the tennis club. Masses of detail from 53 years ago. Big trauma for her. But it wasn't a trauma for her husband. But it was like when the next child came along, her concerns and worries and anxiety were focused around the loss of what would have been a daughter for her. And so this chap, he felt that anxiety, he felt that pressure, and he felt that urgency, but he had no data to go on up here. He wasn't told anything. She never mentioned it to him. The father never mentioned it to him. He was completely without any data in his cognitive brain, but he had all the data in his being, and when it set up, it just showed up. And it's the juxtaposition when there's if you set up two brothers, is it what's in the middle? Was there anybody else? That sort of thing. And it's so powerful, And another aspect